Welcome to Lafayette We're Here, the French history podcast by a Frenchman. I'm your host, Emmanuel Dubois, and today we have a special episode. We have a guest, Charles MacKay, and together we're going to talk about Marie-Antoinette and her son, the ill-fated Louis XVII. So please, Charles, introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us a bit about where your passion for history comes from.
Thank you, Manuel. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on your podcast. I am Charles MacKay. I earned a PhD from Florida State University at the School there of French Revolution and Napoleonic Studies back in 1995. And in terms of my interest in history, my parents and I traveled a lot when I was a kid, and it sort of awokened in me an interest, particularly for the late 18th, early 19th centuries. So when I was in school, I had no idea what I wanted to do, and I just kept going on and on with history and found myself with a PhD. So there you go.
That's very nice. It's nice that it came from your family and your traveling. You know that came from far. That's cool.
Yeah,
That's very
absolutely,
cool.
absolutely.
Nice. I like it when history found you when you were a kid, basically.
It did. It did. Specifically, I remember when I was a little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, I was looking at a history book my parents had, and it has that very famous painting of the British assaulting Breed's Hill during the American Revolution. And you're looking straight down the ranks, right? But you can see on the field their bodies around and military equipment strewn around. I, for the life of me, could not imagine why people would march shoulder to shoulder up a hill only to get machine gunned when they got to the top, because I was 7 years old and I didn't understand how muskets worked at the time. So that's what really started my fascination with the late 18th, early 19th centuries.
Nice. And may I ask why French history specifically?
Yeah, so I was into Scottish history. Both of my dad's parents came from the Highlands of Scotland. So I have a strong connection with my Scottish background. I actually play the bagpipes. I got married in a kilt, the whole business. And I was interested in military history, and I didn't want to do clan feuds. So I thought, well, where else could it be? And then I saw the Scots were fighting all the time in the Peninsular War in the French Revolution. So I did some research for graduate school, found out Don Horwood, who was running the program at Florida State, had a strong research interest in the Peninsular War. So I went down there, and I was 22 years old. And when I got there, he asked me, "Can you speak French?" And I said, "Un petit peu." And he said, "Okay, so you're going to write a biography on General Andoche Junot." And I'm 22 years old, so I said, "Okay, that's what I'll do." And so I just sort of backed into becoming a French historian. But the more I got into it, the more I just absolutely loved it, fell in love with it. I love going to France. I love hanging out in Paris, Burgundy, all over. I'm a big cheese fanatic. I love wine. So it ended up being a marriage of convenience for many reasons.
Nice. It's the old alliance back alive.
Indeed. Yep. Absolutely.
That's very nice. I always appreciated that special connection between France and Scotland. There is always that link over the centuries that I just find fascinating. And up until the period we're going to talk about, because as you know, the French King's Guard was the Scottish Guard. They were Scotsmen.
Absolutely.
And that dates back a long time. And but today we're gonna talk more about his wife and his children. So we're gonna talk about Marie-Antoinette, the famous, or I should say infamous, French queen who suffered during the French Revolution. But we'll start before that. We'll start when she's a young woman brought to France, because Marie-Antoinette is not French; she is Austrian. And
Indeed.
Can you explain why she was chosen to marry the Dauphin, Louis, in 1770 when she is only 14 years old?
Yeah, so she was the last child of Maria Theresa, the famous empress of the Austrian Empire. And the French and the Austrians had sort of had a diplomatic revolution, if you will, in the middle of the 18th century and become allies. And so they wanted to cement that bond further by a marriage between the two royal houses. So Marie Antoinette is chosen because of the similar ages. Louis is only a year older than Marie Antoinette. And so Marie Antoinette is chosen to be the bride to be of the king. Well, what the Dauphin, what will become the King of France.
Okay, so basically they want to patch things up between the two countries and also to improve their relationship going forward. Because,
Yeah, more to improve the relationship.
yeah,
It had been well, for centuries previous, of course, the French and the Austrians had been bitter, bitter enemies.
yes,
But with the rise of Prussia in the 18th century, the all of the math on that changed, and France and Austria felt like they have more in common than not, and so they joined forces. So this is not a popular alliance for the French public, but they want to make it stronger, and a dynastic alliance through a marriage seemed like a good idea. And again, Louis and Marie Antoinette are just the right age. They're young teenagers. For the foreseeable future, Louis wasn't going to be king, so he'd have some time to grow into the position. So, this seems like a great time for a royal marriage between the two families.
yes, and it does make a lot of sense at the time. And it's funny because not so long ago, the French already had a Austrian queen, or at least a Habsburg queen, because all these people are from the Habsburgs family. And
Right.
the French and the Habsburgs has been frenemies for centuries.
Right.
So it all comes down to that moment when you have that young Austrian princess brought to France to marry the future king, as you said, to try to improve the relationship between those two countries who see Prussia growing, and basically they fear that the balance of power on the continent is going to change. Because traditionally, they're the two big guns, the two big countries, or I should say country and empire, because with the Habsburgs it changes all the time. And I know
Yeah.
that Austrians suffered a few defeats to Prussia in the decades before that, and so did France. So
Yes, absolutely.
it's a marriage of convenience, but it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and backing out even further, Poland is deteriorating and Russia is rising, and there's concern about what's going to happen to the fate of Poland. Well, meanwhile, there's bitter fighting between the French and the British for colonies. So the action really isn't in Western Europe. It's either in Eastern Europe or in the wider world, in Africa, in North America, in India, Asia, etc.
Yeah, it's a whole new diplomatic world that is before the French and the Austrians. And
And
yeah,
so, what better way to bring these two together than to marry these two teenagers?
exactly. It
Yep.
it makes sense. I mean, you look at it on paper, it does make sense.
On
Um,
paper, it makes perfect sense.
exactly. But in practice, they're gonna have a few hiccups along the way. We're gonna talk about those.
Maybe not so much. Yes.
When Louis XV dies in 1774, Marie Antoinette's husband becomes King Louis XVI, and she becomes Queen of France. So, although she's
Correct.
far from the first foreigner to become Queen of France, she seems to suffer from a bad reputation in the kingdom from the get go, from day one. So, I wonder, why is that? And can you walk us through some key events in her life before the revolution, such as, for example, the Affaire du Collier, that famous affair that brought her so much shame?
Absolutely. And I'll give just a little bit of a minor pushback because when she arrived in France, she was actually initially pretty popular because she's attractive. She was a blue eyed blonde. She was vivacious. She knew how to dance well. She moved gracefully. And so her first public appearance in June of 1770 after the marriage was a rousing success. I think the problem started, however, with the fact that on the night of the marriage, Louis and Marie Antoinette are put into their bed by, basically the entire population of Versailles. And then, they leave and pull the curtains, and then nothing happens that night. I mean, nothing. Louis rolled over and went to bed. And Marie Antoinette is sort of staring at the ceiling, wondering, okay, what's going on? Well, this continued for several days and then several weeks and then several months. And by the time that Louis becomes king, the marriage still hasn't really been consummated. And so, the rumors start to begin in the French public about what's going on up there in Versailles. Why isn't there an heir to the throne? Because Marie Antoinette's real only purpose, I suppose, it was to help, to create that alliance. But she's making factory. She's there to make an heir for the French Bourbons. And by the time Louis becomes king, this is 4 years into their marriage, and Nothing is going on at this point. But when he does become king, I think one of the most important things he does is he gifts Marie Antoinette with the Petit Trianon, which is a little palace on the grounds of Versailles. It's much, much smaller than the main chateau. And she'll do with that palace whatever she wants to. So she decorates it in her own style. And she was accused by her enemies or her detractors of lavishly decorating, so much so that gold and silver were wallpapered into the walls, that sort of thing. And in reality, that wasn't the case. It was relatively modest, and one of the big differences between Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI in terms of their upbringing, the court in Austria was pretty relaxed, and Marie Antoinette had a great relationship with all of her siblings. The Hauptbrauhaus and the Schönbrunn Palace are both right there in the heart of Vienna, so she interacts with society on a daily basis. And the court ritual there was not nearly as rigid as it was in France. Everything, going back to Louis XIV, everything in the king's day was regimented and a show. When he got up in the morning, there were attendants that would stand around him and help him put his shirt on or buckle his shoes or watch him eat his meals, with the hope that if you were one of those people helping him put his shirt on, that you could say, my nephew needs a regiment. Can I buy a regiment for my nephew, and get some royal favors that way? So there was absolutely no privacy whatsoever. And Marie Antoinette was not used to that and found the whole atmosphere stifling. So Versailles was incredibly stifling for Marie. Well, it was stifling for Louis as well, but he didn't have much choice. He's the king. So he does give Marie Antoinette the Petit Trianon. And from there, she basically removes herself from the main palace and neglects her duties as the queen and just indulges, frankly, in her own interests. She was a horrible, horrible gambler. Louis often had to pay off her debts quietly because he amassed quite a few gambling debts. And then over the years, people just began to sort of question, hey, what's going on down there at the Petit Trianon? And then as sort of resentment grows that Marie Antoinette has all of these riches, and they start to accuse Marie Antoinette of way overspending, and they in fact started to call her Madame Deficit, and they started to complain about what's going on at the Petit Trianon. Is she having lesbian affairs? Is she having affairs with all of these men? And on top of it all, she still has not produced a child. So the resentment really is growing. And finally, in April of 1777, her brother Joseph visits the royal couple incognito. So he's there in disguise. He comes for about 6 weeks or so and stays. And he finally just gets the royal couple together in private and says, okay, guys, what's going on? How come you don't have any kids? And from the correspondence we have from Joseph, he reveals that I'm trying to remember. I cannot remember the exact term, but essentially that Marie Antoinette and Louis have no idea what to do. And Joseph actually wrote that Louis can get an erection, in Joseph's terms, presents the member, remains there for 2 minutes without moving anything, and then withdraws and rolls over and goes to sleep. And neither one of them knew any better about what to do. So, with a little coaching from Joseph, about 10 months, 11 months later, Marie Antoinette, gets pregnant and delivers a baby. And that happens. It was a girl, which, of course, if you follow royal things, is a bit of a bummer. You always kind of want a boy if you can get it. But she gives birth to a baby girl. She names Maria Teresa. And there's all kinds of celebrations in France. And for a brief moment, she regains a little bit of her popularity, but we're still waiting for a male heir.
It's interesting because it shows you the disconnect that these people were living even in daily life. I mean, you have two young people in top shape, they're 18 years old, and they have no clue whatsoever how to make a kid. Because even though, it's common knowledge and it's something that should not be either scary or strange. And as you just said, they had no clue. They were on another planet because of their upbringing in both cases. So I find this fascinating to see how it can affect the people and how it would affect their lives long term, and they needed help. And it took years before they got that help.
It did. It in fact took years. It was almost 8 years before Marie Antoinette finally gave birth after the wedding. And I share your sort of surprise with this, especially for Louis, who one of his favorite things to do was to hunt. So he did spend a lot of time outdoors in nature and things and such. So you would have thought at some point maybe he would have seen at least some animal breeding or something. But no, he apparently had no idea what to do. Then after he was coached, Marie Antoinette does write to her mother, the Empress, that okay, all right, Louis gotten it now, and things are progressing along. And finally, she does give birth to a baby boy in October of 1781. Louis Joseph comes into the world, and finally, she has produced a male heir for France. So we got one now. So hopefully you would think that things might get a little bit better for her, but they don't, because she continues this lavish spending. And the diamond necklace affair is one of the things that you mentioned that sort of plays into this. Although I want to, mention at the onset that Marie Antoinette ultimately in this diamond necklace affair is completely blameless in this whole thing. But so much damage had been done to her reputation about her lavish spending and her gambling debts and her seeming disinterest in what was going on in France, that it really makes the ground fertile for believing all kinds of crazy conspiracies, like what's going to happen with the diamond necklace affair. She leading up to this, it did not help that on the grounds there at Petit Trianon, she had a little peasant village built because she and her friends enjoyed going out to play peasant. So the village was a working village, had French peasants, it had milkmaids, and they grew crops and ground the grain into wheat and made bread and the whole bit. Although there were some peculiarities and some adjustments. Some of the buildings had pool tables, which Marie Antoinette enjoyed very much, which of course you're not going to find in most peasant houses in France. And one anecdote that I think is gives you a good idea of the disconnect between Marie Antoinette and the rest of France. Marie Antoinette did not like the smell of sheep. So before she would go out to play shepherdess with her friends, she would have the peasant shepherds, the real shepherds, douse the sheep in perfume. I think it just kind of underscores the disconnect really between Marie Antoinette and public perceptions of her. Although here I'm not sure she's entirely to blame. Versailles was just weird. There's no other court like it in Europe, that these nobles are completely isolated. It's entirely a bubble of its own making. So they don't interact other than servants. They don't see artisans at work. They don't see peasants doing their thing. They just are completely isolated and out of touch. And Marie Antoinette has no real idea what's going on in France. She doesn't know about crop shortages, about famines, about hard winters, about too much rain in the summer negatively affecting that. She doesn't particularly want to know, but she doesn't make any effort to know. And that dichotomy between the life that she's living and the life that the vast majority of the French population is living really comes into play here. So when the diamond necklace affair breaks out, boy, what a sordid adventure this thing is. In many ways, this could be a movie today, and it would be fantastic. It could be a podcast of its own. There, there was a court woman who had royal lineage, perhaps, but was born into incredibly poor circumstances. And just through grit and determination and a lot of conning, she worked her way into the royal court there at Versailles. And she started to convince anyone who would listen that she had a personal relationship with Marie Antoinette. And so people would come up to her and say, would you please, say something to the queen on my behalf? And she said quite plainly, well, I will, but it will cost you. So she had a little racket going, ferrying messages, which of course never reached the queen's ears. But she's taking the payments from all of these different nobles who want favors. And one of those nobles was the Cardinal de Rohan, who it was from one of the oldest and most powerful families in France. He had been the French ambassador to the court of Vienna and had said some not nice things about the Franco-Austrian alliance. So Marie Theresa, the Empress, was not fond of her, and by extension, Marie Antoinette was not fond of him. And he knew that, and he wanted to get back into the good graces of Marie Antoinette. So he approaches Jeanne de Valois, who's the woman who here is conning everybody into thinking she has a closer relationship with the queen, and says, "Can you help me?" And she says, "Oh yes, of course." So she fakes letters, correspondence from Marie Antoinette to the Cardinal de Rohan, and shakes him down for two different payments of 60,000 livres for charity works. That the cardinal will give this money, and then Marie Antoinette will dispense these to her charities. So he's already on the hook, and she's milking this guy. And then two jewelers contact her, thinking, okay, we might have a conduit here that we can do something. These two jewelers, Charles Bulmer and Paul Bessenage, had created this, completely over the top luxurious necklace at the behest of Louis XV, the previous king, who was going to give it to his mistress, the Madame du Barry. This necklace was just magnificent. It had over 2,800 carats. It had rows and rows of diamonds. This piece was just over the top. And these jewelers had created this piece that Louis XV was going to buy and give it to Madame du Barry. Well, Louis XV died from smallpox before they could finish the necklace. And so when Louis became the king, they offered it to Louis. And Louis offered it as a gift to Marie Antoinette, but Marie Antoinette said, "No, I don't want that thing." Marie Antoinette did not have a good relationship to Madame du Barry, and basically didn't want her stink over that thing. So said, "No, I don't want it." So these jewelers try and hawk this necklace all over Europe, and nobody's buying. It was an insane amount. I saw one figure doing some research for this, that it might be worth 55 million American dollars today. So this thing was way over the top. And in a day and time where things aren't going well for some of these states, getting a necklace that extravagant just seemed imprudent. But these jewelers see, maybe we can approach Marie Antoinette again through this Jeanne de Valois. And what they do is Jeanne de Valois cooks up the scheme where she's going to convince the Duke of Rohan to basically provide the money up front, and that Marie Antoinette will pay him back so she can have the necklace. So they concoct this whole wild plan. The Cardinal de Rohan wants to meet the queen in person, so they arrange for this sort of nocturnal visit. They hire a prostitute who bore a remarkable resemblance to the queen, who stepped in, said a few words, and then they came up and ran her off because they said there were people coming. So the Cardinal Rohan is completely deep in this thing and provides the cash. Jewelers give the necklace to Jeanne de Valois, who immediately just takes the necklace and runs, gives it to her husband. They pry out the jewels and start hawking it in London and Paris and wherever else they can fence this thing. And then, the days and weeks go by, and still Marie Antoinette has not been seen wearing this magnificent necklace. And the jewelers start to ask some questions, and they contact Marie Antoinette's sort of chief servant. And she said, "Yeah, well, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know anything about that." So the servant tells Marie Antoinette immediately, and then this whole scandal blows up. So the Cardinal de Rohan gets arrested. The conspirators get arrested. The Cardinal de Rohan could have had a private trial, but refused and wanted to have a public trial. So he goes before the Parlement de Paris, which is generally more favorable to the nobility than a private setting with Louis would have been. And out of this come all of these lurid details and these fake documents of Marie Antoinette writing to the Cardinal de Rohan with these forged documents. And the sort of icing on the cake for this is that the signature that was produced said Marie Antoinette de France, which any noble worth a moment of time would know that the royal family doesn't sign de France, they just sign their name. And so, the Cardinal Rohan was so blind trying to get back into the good graces of Marie Antoinette that he overlooked this. Nobody knows how. The guy was not terribly bright. And the whole thing just served to sully Marie Antoinette's reputation, because ultimately in the trial, they found the Cardinal de Rohan guilty. They found out he was just a dupe. They did charge Jeanne de Valois with crimes. She was to be branded and imprisoned. She actually escaped and wrote a scathing memoir about the whole thing. The others all ran off and escaped and also wrote memoirs. So this is constant drip, drip, drip about and the main tie for this is that Marie Antoinette has this insatiable lust for the finest things and the most extravagant things. And it was easy for the public to believe that because they had believed all of these libels that had piled up year after year after year. So God bless Marie Antoinette. She was completely innocent of anything nefarious here, but yet gets left with the yucky stain of all of those activities.
Very nice summary, thank you. But yeah, it's because it's quite a complex affair, and so I appreciate you explaining it. And it just shows all the prejudice against that queen. Yeah, she did mistakes, maybe, and she overspent. Yeah, okay, well, she's the French queen. It kind of come with the territory. These things will happen. So when you have a story like that, it just sticks because it makes sense, as you said, to the general public that she would commit such a thing, even though she's completely innocent in that specific affair. So because of all those things, because of her reputation, because of the spending and how exaggerated it becomes, and let's be honest, there is a big dose of sexism involved here.
Oh, absolutely.
Because
absolutely.
she's a woman, so it's a lot easier to blame her and say that she's irresponsible and what have you. And it's something that is a bit more obvious to us maybe in the 21st century, even though it still happens quite a lot, sadly. But there's a lot of sexism that I see here against that young woman. And her, let's say, public life is touchy. Let's put it this way. She has issues with her reputation. Part of it her fault, part of it not at all her fault. But that's the situation in the 1780s. Basically, she has that reputation of being airhead spender. Basically,
yes. In fact, it's funny because her brother and her mother at different times accuse her of the 18th century equivalent of being an airhead. So I do want to tie one thing back to something that you mentioned at the beginning of the cast, which is that she is also Austrian. And when she chose to meddle in politics, it was often seen that she was meddling at Austria's benefit. And of course, that's not going to go over well with the French. But I think some of that was that the French by this point just see everything through an anti Marie Antoinette filter. So, for instance, she was quite active in getting Louis XVI to back the American colonies against the British, and was also active in Eastern Europe, getting some support from Austria and even Russia to make it easier for France to get involved in the American Revolution. Which, okay, you might say, all right, good job, Marie Antoinette. That was smart. But what happens, of course, is that the American colonies get their independence, but France is left with an absolutely mind-boggling, crushing debt because of that. And the French see that as a net negative, not as a net positive. And Marie Antoinette is hassling Louis to get involved in the War of Bavarian Succession, which is ultimately going to benefit the Habsburg family. It would have benefited France too. But so all these little niggling things in terms of also the advisors that she, harps on Louis to appoint, also while having France's best interests at heart, also seemed to have Austria's interests as well. So, she's meddlesome in politics in a way that the French don't appreciate. And some of that is the sexism that you talk about. They don't like women involved in politics in the 18th century in France, but it always seems to be at the benefit of Austria, which is problematic.
Yeah, even though when you could think that when it suits France but suits Austria also, if it's a win-win situation in her mind, she's like, oh, there's an opportunity for me to shine if it works for both countries, because
Right.
that's part of her role. But I see what you mean, that basically if she meddles in politics and the outcome is not perfect or great, of course they're gonna blame her. But I mean, in the end, she was not the one making the decisions. It was either the king of her council, of his ministers, but it's so much easier to blame the woman behind the scene.
Absolutely.
As for Louis himself, he's far from blameless. He had the reputation of basically saying yes to the last person who talked to him. He could be. I'm over exaggerating a bit, but he had this reputation of being.
Oh, I don't think you are, actually. Yeah.
He was indecisive and he was easily influenced, either by, it could be his wife, his minister, his council, what have you, and
his brothers.
Yeah, anybody could influence that man. I mean, he was, in my opinion, and I would not have liked to be in his shoes, but he was not the perfect man to be king, especially in an absolute monarchy. That monarchy was created by kings like Louis XIII or Louis XIV especially, who were very decisive men. But if you don't have that capacity for quick and resolute decision, man, you're in a bad spot. Because everybody looks at you like you're God, basically, and you have to make a decision. And if you're influenced by everybody that talks to you and you change your mind and you don't know where you're going to have a problem. And indeed, in 1789 and after, Louis is going to have a big problem. And so will Marie-Antoinette.
Yeah, I could not have said it better. And I'll just add to that in addition to not being indecisive, Louis also didn't handle stress well. And he also often just escaped through hunting. He did just, whenever life got tense, he would go hunting on the grounds there at Versailles, or on days when the weather was really inclement. He actually built a little shop for locks up in the attic there at Versailles. So he had a little workshop, and he would tinker with complicated locking mechanisms. In times where he couldn't do either one of those things, he ate and drank, often to excess.
And it's funny because, just a small anecdote, lots of people know that on the day that the revolution broke out, the day of the Bastille was taken, July 14, 1789, in Louis XVI's diary, he wrote July 14, rien, or nothing. But he was referring to his hunting day because he had a bad hunting day. He didn't catch anything. So he was referring to that. But of course, the legend has it that he was completely disconnected with what had happened. Well, of course, it's 20 so kilometers away. It takes a few hours for the news to reach the king. It did reach him during the night, but he was not aware immediately that something had gone down. At the Bastille. They don't have phones in the 18th century.
Correct. And in fact, the master of the robe who woke Louis in the middle of the night, that was a complete break of royal protocol. You did not wake the king in the middle of the night, but the master of the robe woke Louis and told him that the Bastille had fallen. And Louis asked him if it was a revolt, and the master of the robe said, "No, sir, no, sire, it's a revolution." Yeah. So that's how Louis became aware.
One of the most known quotes in France: "Non, sire, c'est une révolution." We have that royal couple, and we see their public life is very stressful, but they also have a private life. And as you said, it took them almost 8 years to get their first child, which, was a big issue for the country, but also for them as a couple. And so they will have that first child, Marie-Thérèse, and she will actually survive the revolution, and she will die in Austria in 1851. So she will have a long life. Then they have this boy, Louis-Joseph, who will die of tuberculosis in June 1789, right before the revolution, which I'm sure did not help Louis and Marie-Antoinette's state of mind when the revolution broke out. I mean, they just lost a child. Then you have Louis Charles, who will become the hypothetical Louis XVII, and we'll circle back to him. And finally, we have Sophie, who will die as a toddler in 1787. So basically, we have two children who will survive years with their parents. So, what was the relationship between Marie-Antoinette, King Louis, and their children? And how did the death of Louis-Joseph and Sophie affect them?
That's a great question. I think initially Marie Antoinette was not that interested in being a parent or having, a lot of action or a lot of attention in the daily life. But the diamond necklace affair really changed Marie Antoinette's sort of perception. I think she finally realized at that point that there was such a thing as public opinion, which had been new. Cafe culture had only started in France in the 18th century. So the idea that royals would be subject to, the whims or the thoughts of the public at large was a bit of a new concept. And once the diamond necklace affair broke and Marie Antoinette really understood the libels and the hatred. She really started to clean up her act. She cut her expenses dramatically. She started to have portraits commissioned that would show her with the children, and she started to spend more and more time with her children, involved in their education. And Louis never took a mistress, informal or not. And as the trials and tribulations mount against the royal couple as we get into the 1780s and get into the revolution, these two, Marie Antoinette and Louis, grow closer and closer together, both as a couple and just as two human beings, because they have the same background, they have the same breeding, they were brought up with the same values. And so, even though Marie Antoinette is outgoing and vivacious and an extrovert, and Louis is the most introverted of introverts you could find, they start to see commonalities. And as the pressure really mounts on them, these two get closer and closer together, and they kind of pull their children to them closer and closer. So when Louis Joseph dies of tuberculosis, it was a crushing blow to both of them. And by all accounts, he didn't go to bed one night and just not wake up. He suffered in death, and of course, they're powerless to do anything in the 18th century for tuberculosis. And so when Marie Antoinette, she's watching Louis Joseph die from tuberculosis, and it was a horrible, painful death, and there wasn't anything she could do. She just had to watch him die, and that was a horrible thing. And then Louis went into a profound depression. And it was kind of there that Marie Antoinette kind of realized that, okay, if anybody's going to hold this family together, I kind of got to hold this family together. So, as we say in America, it was really at that point that she kind of put her big girl panties on and starts to resemble in behavior more her mother, Maria Theresa, than the frivolous girl that came to France in the 1770s. But she was very upset with the French public because the Louis Joseph's death went almost without any remark. It passed without much notice from the French public because they're all just consumed with, the opening days of the Estates General and what's eventually going to become the French Revolution. And, nobody's paying attention to the fact that this royal couple has lost their first son.
Yeah, which would be crushing to anybody. I mean, any parent can feel the pain of losing a child, especially as you mentioned, the poor kid suffered a long time before passing. So I can imagine them being psychologically completely wrecked in the summer of 1789. And that's exactly the moment that the French public chooses to storm the Bastille. So it's kind of a double whammy, as you say in the States. When the revolution breaks out in July 1789, how does Marie Antoinette respond? And What impact did she have on Louis' decisions in 1789, but also over the next couple of years? Because we talk a lot about the king and all the mistakes that he did or did not do, whatever, but we don't talk much about her during that period. What did she do? How did she respond? And what happened with her during that period?
Yeah, so she would be one of the leading candidates for a repressive approach to the revolution. In fact, she might be one of the people directly responsible for the actual physical storming of the Bastille because she was on Louis to, man, this is crazy. She called the Estates General a pack of madmen and was pressing Louis to bring in troops, foreign troops, if necessary, to suppress the revolution, restore order, and rule like a king. Now, she's not the only one doing this. Louis's two brothers, in particular, were adamant that that more draconian steps needed to be taken. So she's not in isolation, trying to pressure Louis to get tough with the revolution. And I think Louis's natural would have been to be a little bit more forgiving and maybe be more inclined to listen to the grievances of his countrymen. But the prevailing winds from within inside the court said, "Crush this thing." So as French soldiers get and as foreign soldiers get closer to the capital and to Paris, as you know, the Parisians panicked and stormed the Bastille, killed the governor, and that marks the beginning of what we all know as the French Revolution. Of course, it's a national holiday for France today. But all throughout this, so then I'm not going to go through the whole French Revolution, but during this time, they're going to try and create a constitution and morph France into a constitutional monarchy. And Marie Antoinette was dead set against this and pressured Louis at every turn to assert himself, to assert royal privilege and power, and to try and assert control. But events overtake them, and especially the Women's March in October of 1789. Completely unforeseen circumstance. Some women in Paris, again, struggling to find food and find food they can afford, come up with the idea that there's probably food in Versailles. And so they're going to march to Versailles spontaneously and demand that Paris be given access to food. And so off they go. And as you say, it's 11, 12 miles from Paris to Versailles, onerous walk. So they arrive at the grounds of Versailles, and there's this enormous crowd of angry women, some of them armed with broom handles or kitchen knives or pitchforks, old fowling pieces, and nobody knows what to do because you just don't shoot into crowds of women. There were some men there, of course, as well, but it was primarily a women's march. And so violence did break out. Two French guards were killed, including the guard that warned Marie Antoinette that the crowd was coming because they were looking for her specifically to kill her. So he warns the queen. She escapes through a secret door and heads to the king's apartments. And the crowd breaks into her bedchamber, and they shredded her bed. They stabbed it, ruined it, tore it to ribbons, because they couldn't get to her. And then finally, Lafayette with the National Guard shows up. Lafayette doesn't quite know what to do, but he does restore order. The crowd demands to see Louis, and Louis comes out, and then they demand to see Marie Antoinette. And the demand there was a little bit darker, and there were people in the crowd that had muskets and things. And initially, Marie Antoinette came out onto the balcony with her children, and then the crowd more ominously said, "Come back out without your children." And to Marie Antoinette's credit, she did. She put the kids down, put them, left them inside the palace, and came out on the balcony. And from eyewitness, recollection, stood there for about 10 minutes. And she managed in that 10 minutes to maybe change a little bit, at least momentarily, the mood of the crowd. And in fact, there were even a few Vive-la-Reine shouts heard from the crowd. Nevertheless, the women demand that the royal family come with them to Paris so that they can make sure that there's enough bread to feed everybody in Paris. So at that point, the royal family become prisoners, escorted by Lafayette and the National Guard to the Tuileries, a palace kind of capping the end of the Louvre Museum. The building isn't there now. It got destroyed in the 1870s, but it was an end piece to where the Louvre is. So if your listeners have been to the Louvre, to the art museum, the open end that looks out Esplanade towards the Place de la Concorde, which will be where the guillotine is set up, and then ultimately to the Arc de Triomphe, there was a palace there, the Tuileries, and that's where the royal family's imprisoned.
I can imagine how she felt having to go on that balcony with a very, very hostile crowd. I mean, today when a politician talks about a hostile crowd, they're gonna yell at me. Well, here they could shoot at you, and you don't know if you come out of the balcony alive, literally, not politically. So it's very impressive, and it's something that often people don't know about Marie Antoinette. That whole period she had to go through.
Yeah, she showed a lot of grit and determination, and frankly, personal bravery there.
But as you said, her and a lot of the royal entourage are dead set against the revolution, and they will tell Louis, you have to be tough. And even though Louis, to his credit, he always was reluctant to have troops shooting at French citizens. That's not something he was. I mean, some kings didn't care. He cared. He didn't want to get people killed for nothing. That's obvious in his character. As you said, he was hesitant to do that. Luckily enough, Lafayette, who was head of the French National Guard, was also not the kind of man who would just shoot without asking questions. He would think before acting, which is always good with a military commander. And
absolutely,
yeah. But nevertheless, as you said, now they're prisoners in Paris, and they will try to make that sort of constitutional monarchy work. Let's put it this way. I mean, it's not exactly that. I'm oversimplifying, but basically, they try to work with the revolution. There is bad faith on both sides. And at some point, Louis makes a decision. He decides that they're going to flee France, and they're going to try to turn the situation on its head from abroad. So that's the famous flight to Varennes that happens in June 1791. It's called Flight to Varennes because they were caught in Varennes. They were not heading to Varennes. They were actually, as I said, trying to escape France. So Marie-Antoinette, the king, and the rest of the royal family are caught. And the only thing they left behind, and I never understood why they did that, is a letter where they condemn the revolution and its leaders. It's like, if that letter is not there, maybe they could make up a story of why they left. But with that letter, there is no story to be had. You just wrote it plainly that you were against everything that happened over the last 2 years. So you're stuck. So they're brought back to Paris in a procession known as the Monarchy's Hearse, which is very named. And we know quite well what happened at the state level. Over the next year, the French Republic will be proclaimed, the monarchy will be abolished. But what happens to Marie Antoinette and her two surviving children at this point? What becomes of that family before 1793?
That's a great question. Part of Marie Antoinette's challenge is that in once they start digging up documents of the flight to Varennes, it's actually Marie Antoinette who plays the guiding role in putting this plan together, along with her reputed lover Axel von Fersen, of course, in concert with other nobles and with the Austrian royal family. So she's implicated directly in the flight to Varennes as the main driving force behind convincing Louis that it would be a good idea to flee France, put yourself at the head of an Austrian army, and then come back and take France by force. So she's got some challenges. And as you mentioned, the Tuileries was stormed by Parisians in August of 1792. Louis and Marie Antoinette have to flee to protection for the Legislative Assembly. And then at that point, they're like virtual prisoners. Louis himself was put on trial for treason and executed in January of 1793. So this leaves Marie Antoinette alone with the two remaining children. Sophie, of course, had died as an infant or a toddler in 1787, and they had lost Louis Joseph at the beginning of the French Revolution. So all that's left is her oldest daughter, Maria Theresa, and her second son, Louis Charles. And initially, they're locked in the Temple, which is a medieval fortress in the heart of France, in not great conditions, and they're observed every day. And so Marie Antoinette throws herself into educating her children and devoting all of her time and energy really into her children. But what else could she do? There wasn't, you know, I think she found solace in that. I don't want to undersell that. I think she found solace and comfort in that, but there wasn't really anything for her to do. And then her son, just unexpectedly, the revolutionaries come in and they separate Louis Charles from his mother in the summer of 1793. And that was, of course, gut wrenching. If you're a parent, you could just imagine what it must be like that things beyond your control simply take your child away from you. Now, Marie Antoinette did know that Louis Charles was still in the temple because, unfortunately, she could hear him crying almost incessantly day and night in somewhere. And she would spend hours looking out like a little slitted hole in the room he had. And then she was transferred to the conciergerie and was held in basically one dank room. And, writing at that point had to be on the wall. And so her trial is going to come in October of 1793.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. I can imagine the poor woman. I mean, first she's imprisoned, then her husband is guillotined, then a few months later her child is taken from her, and then her own trial happens. I mean, it's boom, 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 boom. And as you said, there's nothing she can do about it. The only thing she tried to do, and it's all to her credit, was to do the best she could by her children. She did not collapse. She tried her best, which is honorable.
No, it seems she got stronger and stronger and stronger the more adversity she faced. And the trial that happens in October of 1793, she's not aware it's coming. There was a royalist plot to maybe break her out of the conciergerie, and I think it was at that point that the revolutionaries decided, listen, we gotta get rid of Marie Antoinette. So they decided to put her on trial. I have a feeling that the conclusion, was foregone, but they put her on trial, and she was allowed a defense, but they had less than a day to prepare. And there's a mountain of documents with Marie Antoinette's, handprints all over them. Essentially, I don't think there was ever in doubt that there was going to be treason. But the revolutionaries, including all of the other things about overspending and wasting the treasury of the state and colluding with foreign powers, they also accused her of having an incestuous relationship with her son, with Louis Charles. And the sort of best piece of evidence they had were coerced confessions out of Louis Charles. So there's some. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in these sorts of things. I'm not sure brainwashing is the right idea, but they planted some ideas in Louis Charles's head, and then days and days of this, and mistreatment and beatings and withheld food and solitary confinement. And this little boy's 8 years old, and they confessed this confession that Marie Antoinette had done these unspeakable things. And when she was charged with them, initially she made no answer. And when pressed by one of the deputies, well, are you going to respond to this? She gave an impromptu and elegant speech about essentially that no mother would ever do this. There's no reason for me to answer these charges because there's no way any mother would ever do that. And in fact, the speech was so persuasive, and at that point, the prosecutor did not press any more of the, didn't press this account any further. And then Marie Antoinette was found guilty at 4 o'clock in the morning. And then on 16 October 1793, she was guillotined at the Place de la Concorde as well. And you want to talk about some of your sexism again. The libels they accused Marie Antoinette of every kind of sexual perversion possible: bestiality, lesbianism, incest. These things, the only other figure I can think of in the 18th century who had a similar treatment was Catherine the Great of Russia. And here you see another powerful woman, tried to I suppose, cut down to size with these sorts of things. But even the treatment of Marie Antoinette from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Concorde, Louis goes there in a enclosed carriage. Marie Antoinette does not. She's her hands are bound behind her tightly. She has a simple white dress on that had stains on it. They cut her hair in anticipation of the execution, and then she is made to ride in an open cart between the Conciergerie and the Place de la Concorde, which, if you were to walk today, that's going to take you, what, 20, 30 minutes. It's not a couple of yards, couple of meters down the way. It's a fair piece. And of course, it's lined with the public, and they're hurling invectives. They're throwing excrement, rotten food, all kinds of things at her as she progresses. And she doesn't flinch. She doesn't cry. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't beg mercy. She doesn't wail. She head up the entire time. And she mounted the scaffolding by herself. And when she got up to the platform, she accidentally stepped on the toe of the executioner and turned to the executioner and said, "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't do it on purpose." And those are her last recorded words. And then they put her on the board, set her into the guillotine, and then off came her head.
It's impressive, as you say, how stronger she became, even though facing literally impossible odds against herself and her family. And speaking of which, if we circle back just a little bit, when Louis XVI is guillotined, so when a king dies in a monarchy, his successor becomes king instantly. So in France, when this happens, they say "Le roi est mort, vive le roi." The king is dead, long live the king. So legend has it that Marie-Antoinette said that to Louis XVII, her son, when she learned of her husband's decapitation. So first, acknowledging him as king, Louis XVII. So what do you make of that? And what do you think are the consequences of having this, in theory, young king in jail during that period of the revolution, both within and without France?
I have not made up my mind about whether I think Marie Antoinette actually said that. I know that she was vested in her son's interest, and I thought that way, especially when it looked like, the Louis XVI, ever since, say, 1787, Louis XVI did not look like he was going to be a guy that would be able to hold it together. And so she knew that she had to act in the best interest of her son for the future. So I can see her saying that. But at the same time, under those circumstances, I don't know. My jury, I'm out on that one personally. I don't know if she said that or not. Obviously, the child was aware of what had happened. The whole family was aware. Louis was allowed to greet them for one last time, so everybody knew that he was going to be executed the following morning. So it's not a secret about what happened. In terms of France, having the potential heir in custody while you're fighting a war, because war had broken out with Austria in April of 1792, and then within months, basically the rest of the known European world had declared war on France. So the French are under incredible pressure, and obviously having the heir to the throne as your prisoner is dangerous. And so I think there was a political calculation made. So they don't kill Louis Charles. They do not execute him. He is mistreated in every possible way, including held in solitary confinement for 6 months at a go, with only a slit for his food that's shoved through that passage. The folks that checked on Louis Charles at the end of his life, remarked at how in poor health he was. But they did not execute him. Apparently, the revolutionaries even had I don't know, maybe executing a child was a little a little too much. Louis's brothers were still quite active just across the frontier there in modern day Belgium. And I think there was more interest played on or focused on them, what they might do and what role they would play than an 8-year-old boy. But ultimately, I don't think any of the revolutionaries were too upset when Louis Charles passed from, well, I mean, I hesitate to call them natural causes, but when he died from mistreatment in prison in 1795.
Imagine, any kid in such a situation being mistreated like that is just totally heartbreaking, whatever the situation, revolution or not. It's something yet you would hope would never happen. And yet, it happens, and it's horrible. And that poor kid, I can imagine in his mind, there's one side of his brain saying, "You're the king of France." And the other side, "Yeah, but you're rotting in a jail cell." It must be damaging to this young boy's psychology even more than just being a prisoner, because there's that mix going on in his brain that what the hell is going on, especially when he was brought up in the Palace of Versailles.
I'm not sure at that age that he's thinking I'm the king and I should be able to do this, because obviously he knows he's eating hand to mouth. There were a couple of times when some of the revolutionaries went in to question him, and he did not speak for days on end. Under questioning, they would question and question, and he gave absolutely no response, no utterance whatsoever. Not to ask for food, not to ask for a blanket, not to answer their questions. He said nothing for days on end. So obviously, he's doing the math in his head and trying to figure out how to survive this circumstance, this situation. And I'm a parent as well. I have two sons. They're older than yours, but whew, it
Yeah, we
it's
feel for
intense.
him. I mean,
It's intense.
you feel for him. I mean, it makes sense that he would not respond. You just said he wants to survive. That instinct kicks in at this point. Where he was down to that poor little boy. I know when in France there's a lot of stories about him that maybe he escaped, maybe his jailer exchanged him with another kid. Some say he was killed on purpose, but as you said, he basically died of mistreatment over a long period of mistreatment, and he died in prison because of that. So they did not technically execute him, but it's the same thing. They killed that boy by the way they treated him. So the revolution, the French Revolution, has many positives long term, but the negatives also have a big column, and that's in the negative pie. Mistreating a family like that, having a young kid die in a jail cell for absolutely nothing. There is no way you can defend that, even if you had the best of intention, if you will.
I'm not sure if they give themselves any redemption, but they did. So how Maria Theresa ends up living, the daughter, how she ends up living to into her 70s. She's part of a prisoner exchange. The French state and the Austrians are exchanging prisoners in the course of the war, and she is one of the prisoners exchanged to Austria. So that's how Maria Theresa, the daughter, ends up, and she does marry, but she never had any children. So Marie Antoinette had no descendants. But that's how she actually survived the revolution and lived into her 70s.
We tend to forget that, yes, they are the children of the French king, but they're also the grandchildren of the Empress of Austria. So they were important children on both sides of the border. So speaking of that, and to conclude that bit of a grim story, what do you think are the legacies of Marie Antoinette and the ill-fated little Louis XVII?
Well, I mean, can you believe that the two of us got through an entire podcast on Marie Antoinette and we didn't talk about the quote about "let them eat cake"? That I think for many people is the first thing they think of Marie Antoinette. This reputed quote that, when she learned that the French population was starving, she's reputed to have said, "Well, if they don't have bread, let them eat cake," which of course is just bread with sugar added in, which was a luxury product at the time. She never said that, but I think in the minds of many people, if they know anything about Marie Antoinette, it's that enduring inaccurate quote, and that's because of the damage that had been done year after year after year to her reputation without any retort from the French monarchy, and just because she made a lot of bad decisions, and so I think it's pretty clear that the French were able to, or the French were willing to take out their years and centuries of frustrations against royalty and the feudal system, against, to a certain extent, Louis XVI, but primarily Marie Antoinette, in part because she's a woman, in part because she's Austrian, in part because she just made some bad decisions. For Louis Charles, boy, so he's fashioned Louis XVII. He never ruled, and it was really Louis's brothers that end up picking up the. I won't say baton because that has too many Napoleonic overtones. They end up picking up the crown and carrying it into the early part of the 19th century. So, yeah, I think that's what I have to say on that.
Yeah, they did recognize him as Louis XVII. That's why Louis' brother becomes Louis XVIII with the Bourbon Restoration. That's a question I've had a few times on my podcast by email. Why is he the 18th? Where's the 17th? And yeah, that's that poor boy who died in prison, which he's recognized because of royal lineage. They at this time they didn't consider the revolution to be an interruption of the monarchy. So technically, he was the 17th. He died, and then the crown went to the king's brother, which is the logical thing in a monarchy to happen. And yes, that sentence, qu'il mange de la brioche, let them eat cake, that's something that today, I'm sure the majority of people, even in France, think she actually said that. That she was that complete airhead, completely disconnected with reality. And yes, because of her upbringing, because of many things, yes, she did not know what was actually going on in France. But I don't think she was ill-intended towards the French population. She just was given a very bad set of cards. She didn't know. She was not well informed. She was not brought up in a way that she would care about the population until she was faced with this situation. And as you said, when she was faced with a terrible situation, she did some mistakes, but in the end, she showed strength and character, which you would not expect by looking at how she behaved in her 20s, for example. So in an impossible situation, I think she was way smarter than we give her credit for, but she didn't have the occasion to show that strength and that intelligence until she was basically on trial. That's history, as we say. That's part of history, of French history. It's sad, and what happened to her child is more than sad. It's absolutely horrible, but it has to be talked about. It has to be reminded. People have to remember those things happened in France during the Revolution. You mentioned that she was imprisoned in the Conciergerie. For those who don't know and who have looked at the Olympics opening ceremonies, the Conciergerie is that building when they had a representation of Marie-Antoinette with her head in her hands.
Yes.
And you had that metal group called Gojira playing while you had that singer singing Carmen at the same time, which show-wise was fantastic. But that's the building, that's the Conciergerie.
Well, I did a double take when I saw that. I'm familiar with that symbolism, so I was, wow, okay, we're going there, huh?
Yeah, and she's singing Saira, 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 which is a revolutionary song, basically saying down with the nobles. But that's basically the gist of the song. And you had this very modern interpretation by Gojira. And it's a good example that it is part of the French story. The French live with that very bloody revolution, that very horrible revolution on many aspects, and yet that's why we have a French Republic today. That's why we had the Declarations of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. That's why we had so many good things. But these good things happened after many horrible things happened. So that's what makes it fascinating. That's why we are here 200 years after having a podcast about it. And those people who died long before we were even born in another country, nonetheless. But it's complicated. It's as our friend says in another podcast, it's all gray history. It's not black and white.
Right.
And what happened to Marie-Antoinette is a perfect example of that. It's not black and white. There are a lot of gray.
And it's not static either, because Marie Antoinette grows as a person. She starts life one way and then ends it as, in many ways, a different individual. And I think sometimes we tend to think of some of these characters of history as well. You alluded to it being two-dimensional, but also being static, that they don't change, and that's certainly not the case here with Marie Antoinette.
Also, our perspective on her changes too with time. The historiography on Marie Antoinette has evolved a lot in the 20th century.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and our understanding of Louis has too. And I think I might have been a little hard on Louis in this podcast, but I think Louis is in a sense two people. I can't imagine a better friend or someone personally to have in your corner than Louis. He had so many admirable traits: loyal, and he was actually pretty smart. He was empathetic, good man. I'm not aware that he ever told a lie. Louis is a good human being. He's just so poorly prepared to be king, as you had mentioned. So therein lies a dichotomy that's always going to be fascinating for historians.
And often the people who were very good, effective kings, well, they would not be good friends. They would not be nice people. They would be brutal. They would be strong, and they would boss you around. That's why they were effective kings. As you said, Louis is the kind of guy you could go have a beer with, or maybe a nice glass of wine. That would be more soothing, I imagine. Before we sign off, Charles, can you please tell the listeners where they can find you if they want to reach out to find out what you write about?
Excellent. Yes. So I am on Twitter, or X, I guess these days, at Bubbles Vampire. I'm also on Blue Sky with the same handle, Bubbles Vampire. And so that's where they can find me.
Excellent. And can I ask where does that handle comes from?
A funny story involving, in fact, my oldest son, when he was like 10 or 11 years old, was making a Dungeons and Dragons adventure for his friends. And he came to me and said, "Dad, I need a name for a vampire, but I don't want it to be too scary." So I said, just instinctively, "Well, why don't you call him Bubbles?" And so we laughed about it. And then Bubbles, the vampire, just sort of took on a life of its own within our family. And then when I started with Twitter and I wanted a nom de plume, that's what I went with.
It's it's part of the legacy of your son already.
Yes, absolutely.
There you go. So thank you very much, Charles. I really appreciate that discussion we've had. I'm sure the listeners will too. We've learned a lot about Marie-Antoinette, her family, and maybe we understand her a bit better now, thanks to you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
You're most welcome. And thank you very much. Have a good evening. Au revoir.
Au revoir.
You can find the Lafayette We Are Here podcast wherever you get your podcasts or on LafayettePodcast.com. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Lafayette Podcast. You can also reach me on social media or by email. All the links are on the website. The music for this podcast is the Marche pour la cérémonie des Turcs, composed by Jean-Baptiste Lully, arranged and performed by Jérôme Arfouche.